The 56th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 62, entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow, the 24th of February, marks the second solemn anniversary of the launch by the Russian Federation's, the launch of the Russian Federation's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, plunging its sovereign neighbor and innocent civilians into terror and suffering. The world bore witness as that fateful day marked the onset of a series of protracted, illegal, and flagrant violations of the UN Charter and of international law. As you, the representatives of UN member states, gather here today, you can neither be blind to the ongoing destruction and devastation or ignore the plight of the people of Ukraine. This is especially so because this year also coincides with the 10th anniversary of the 2014 attempted illegal annexation of Crimea and other Ukrainian territories by the Russian Federation. Excellencies, over the past 2 years, millions of innocent civilians have been uprooted from their homes and forced to flee in search of safety and shelter. Schools and hospitals, constituting key elements of civilian infrastructure protected from attack under international law, as symbols of hope and healing, today lie in utter and calculated ruin. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has verified disturbing increases in non-combatant casualties, with the number of civilian deaths and injuries in January of this year hiking 37% higher than in November of 2023. And in the midst of all of this, we must not overlook the peculiar situation of Ukrainian children, thousands of whom were torn from their families and forcibly deported to Russia, thus stripped of the warmth and safety of their homes and loved ones. These innocent children, unlawfully abducted, must be repatriated to Ukraine and reunited with their families at once. But we must also be mindful that the impact of this war extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The environment, the silent victim of conflict, is threatened by the chemical effluent released from damaged facilities and from the increased pollution and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the ongoing fighting. Further, the militarization of the nuclear sites runs the real risk of a nuclear accident, an outcome that would undoubtedly spell a disaster of epic proportions. And ultimately, the war has affected every member state gathered in this hall, whether in the form of soaring food prices or in the context of energy insecurity. Without doubt, this needless war has been a significant catalyst in reshaping world geopolitics and geoeconomics, not only inflicting direct harm on the countries involved, but also impeding the developmental progress of numerous others, especially developing countries. It is actively undermining the very foundations of our UN Charter, threatening the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity we all committed to hold dear and to defend. It has bred and accentuated distrust, instability, and unpredictability on a global scale. It has disrupted the delicate balance of international relations at a time when unity, solidarity, and cooperation are absolutely crucial to multilateral problem solving. Excellencies, we are simultaneously grappling with the existential threat of climate change and strive to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We cannot afford to let aggression and conflict derail our progress. We must never forget, war stands in direct opposition to the goals we have committed to pursue. Consequently, the responsibility falls upon each and every one of us to uphold and to defend the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, our charter, and in doing so, to ensure the primacy of and respect for the rule of law. That includes heeding the orders of international courts, particularly those rendered by the International Court of Justice in March of last year, calling for the Russian Federation to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. While the Security Council may be paralyzed by division, let us draw strength from the collective voice of the General Assembly, which has pronounced itself condemning the aggression and demanding the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Beyond condemnations, we, the United Nations, must actively work towards a comprehensive, just, and sustainable peace in line with the charter of this organization. The resolution adopted by the General Assembly a year ago provides a roadmap to achieve this goal. I note with appreciation the international consultations that have occurred in Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Malta, and most recently in Davos, Switzerland. These consultations build on the General Assembly's resolutions and represent crucial steps towards finding a permanent solution to this crisis. We must support all efforts that could open the possibility of a process aimed at resolving this conflict through diplomacy and dialogue, always ensuring that such processes align with the foundational principles of the Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Excellencies, honorable ministers, as we reflect on the 2 years of anguish and hardship, let us emerge from this place with a resounding message of solidarity and unwavering support to the resilient people of Ukraine. They have endured unimaginable suffering with dignity, courage, and resilience, and continue to marshal the strong determination to defend their homeland. As the United Nations and this General Assembly, we must stand with them in their quest for justice and peace. And as your president, I join you in this clarion call. Let us redouble our efforts to end wars and usher in a future of hope, promise, and prosperity for the people of Ukraine and Russia alike, and indeed elsewhere without exception. Let us use this meeting to reaffirm our commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and to the rule of law. Together we can build a world where not only does peace prevail, but moreover, justice reigns supreme. I thank you. As announced yesterday via the e-delegate portal, I would like to remind members that they are encouraged to limit their statements to no more than 5 minutes in order to allow as many delegations as possible to deliver statements at the meeting this morning before continuing on Monday, the 26th of February. It is my pleasure now to invite His Excellency Dmytro Kuleba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, to take the floor. Excellency, the floor is yours.
I am grateful to all UN member states who have consistently supported important General Assembly calls condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and urging Moscow to cease hostilities. This Assembly has demonstrated on numerous occasions that the global majority stands on the side of Ukraine, which is effectively the side of the UN Charter, international law, and peace. Over 140 member states have chosen exactly such a fair stance. This represents roughly 3/4 of the United Nations. If this Assembly could end the war and restore Ukraine's territorial integrity through passing a bill, Ukraine would already be at peace. If Russia had implemented the order of the International Court of Justice of March 16, 2022, we would also already be living in peace. Let me remind you that the court indicated among its provisional measures that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations it began on February 24, 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. End of quote. This legally binding decision remains in force today. We can also see that in these 2 years, global security has only deteriorated. More and more wars and conflicts are flaring up across the globe. One of the reasons for this is the bleeding wound in the heart of Europe. Unfortunately, Russia ignores the will of the global majority. It continues its aggression and throws more and more men into the flames of war. It persists in killing and maiming Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, as well as brutally violating basic human rights in the occupied territories. Distinguished delegates, Russia cannot ignore the voice of the world majority if we all take a principled stance and act together. The peace formula proposed by President Zelensky represents exactly such an opportunity. You are all aware of the formula's 10 points. They envisage not only the end of hostilities, but also proposals to strengthen food security, nuclear safety, environmental protection, energy security, international justice, human rights, and respect for the UN Charter. Ukraine has been working tirelessly to mobilize international support for our peace plan. In less than a year, the number of countries and international organizations taking part in peace formula meetings went up from 15 to 82. And I thank every nation and every institution, including the United Nations, for joining. This demonstrates a growing global understanding that the peace formula is the only way forward to a just and lasting peace. Most importantly, countries involved in this process represent all continents and regions of the world. This is not a Western undertaking. This is a truly global initiative based on the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. Ukraine is now actively working with partners to prepare the first Global Peace Summit that is set to take place in Switzerland. I strongly encourage every UN member state present in this assembly to take active part in the process and attend the future Global Peace Summit. This will be a real opportunity to agree on a fair and comprehensive vision of peace. Once we have this global and common position, Russia will have no other choice than to engage in this process in good faith. Mr. President, dear member states, the scale of this war and its global implications are enormous, as well as the suffering of Ukrainians. I particularly drive your attention to the fate of thousands of prisoners of war who are still in Russian captivity. They are often mistreated, and Russia obstructs access of international monitors to them. They must be released and exchanged. Human rights violations in the occupied territories include political persecution, arbitrary detentions, torture, and sexual abuse, as well as forced conscription and intentional altering of demographics. Stealing Ukrainian children and taking civilian hostages are some of the most horrible Russian crimes. In our view, UN can and should be more active and swift in deploying existing instruments and developing the new ones when necessary to help bring back Ukrainian children deported to Russia, return civilian captives, the most internationally overlooked vulnerable group, prosecute systemic cases of sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians and servicemen, and crimes against environment. There is literally not a single atrocity listed in the Rome Statute that Russia has not committed in the course of this war. And it is not surprising that the Russian president himself is on the ICC wanted list for stealing Ukrainian kids. And with all of this in the background, Russia has enough insolence to try to shift the blame and evade responsibility. It spread numerous lies in order to manipulate public opinion abroad and blame others for the war that Moscow says started and refuses to end. I therefore call on everyone present in this assembly and outside of it to dismiss Russian lies. They are nothing more than attempts to shift the blame and avoid responsibility. The only reason for this war has been and remains Russia's denial of Ukraine's right to exist and its continued colonial conquest. Moscow's aim is to destroy Ukraine, and they're quite outspoken about it. Dear colleagues, fellow diplomats, no nation in the world wants peace more than Ukraine. Our country suffers the most, but we also know that peace must be just and durable. Simply putting the war on hold and hoping that the aggressor will be merciful enough to eventually choose peace is not a realistic plan. Those who say that Ukraine just needs to negotiate with Russia and end the war are either ill-informed or never followed what happened between 2014 and 2022. During that 8 years, Ukraine and Russia held approximately 200 rounds of peace negotiations in various formats and made 20 ceasefire agreements. All of these peace efforts ended 2 years ago, when Russia tore apart the Minsk process and launched its full-scale invasion of my country. Why would anyone suggest today that following the same logic will bring us to a different result? Ukraine's peace formula remains the only serious peace proposal on the table, and every peace-loving nation in this assembly, and I'm certain that the absolute majority of you represent peace-loving nations, can add its diplomatic weight to putting the peace formula in action. If we are serious about restoring peace not only in Ukraine but also globally, it is time to abandon wishful thinking and engage in realistic and hard work. The Global Peace Summit offers exactly such a concrete and realistic path to peace. I urge all of you to assist us in the undertaking. And I would also like to conclude by saying thank you to every nation that has stood by the people of Ukraine throughout these terrible years. We shall jointly prevail. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to take the floor.
Mr. President, I think that for anyone who is capable of an independent, unbiased analysis of the situation, it is obvious that the topic under discussion today at the United Nations General Assembly has nothing to do with reality and serves solely to promote a political agenda. The reality is that there are no temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, but there are Russian regions such as Crimea, the 10th anniversary of the reunification with which we will celebrate in March, and the regions which acceded as a result of the legitimate expression of the people's will, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, as well as the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. We have heard and will continue to hear many lies on the subject today from the representatives of Kiev and its Western sponsors. Behind this is a desire not just to distort the facts, but to rewrite history in general. The fact is that the truthful, undistorted version of history is extremely inconvenient for our Western colleagues, because then they would have to admit their responsibility for provoking and unleashing the Ukrainian crisis, for years of preparing Ukraine for war with Russia under the pretext of the Minsk agreements, for nurturing the sprouts of nationalism and neo-Nazism in Ukraine, which have come into full bloom there since 2013. Of course, our Western neighbors, our Western colleagues do not want to do any of this. Their interests are served by propagating a black and white narrative where Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the innocent victim. However, the collective West will still have to answer for what has been done to Kiev, as well as for the selective blindness and deafness that it has shown throughout all these years. How can countries that claim to be civilized and democratic not hear, for example, the statements made in 2015 by Prime Minister Yatsenyuk that those who live in Donbass are subhuman, or the words of incumbent President Zelensky in 2021, who called them creatures and specimens? Those who are in possession of the facts regarding Kiev's actions and are not trying to replace reality with propaganda do not have any questions regarding the reasons behind the incorporation of new subjects into the Russian Federation. It was a natural consequences of the policy of exterminating its own population that was carried out by the neo-Nazi regime, which came to power in 2014 as a result of the bloody coup organized, sponsored, and openly supported by the West. Having always felt an unbreakable historical and cultural bond to Russia, the citizens living in the southeast of Ukraine did not want to submit to these new illegitimate authorities, which demanded that they renounce their own cultural and historical identity and glorify Hitler's accomplices, which were responsible for the mass murder of Jews, Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians during the Second World War. Then the post-Maidan radical nationalists began to ignore the fundamental rights and freedoms of their own fellow citizens and began persecuting undesirable populations on ethnic, linguistic, and religious grounds. They imposed a financial and social blockade on the inhabitants of Donbass, stopped paying social benefits and patients, and deprived them of healthcare services. Almost every year, new laws were adopted that made the situation of Donbass's population worse and worse. Throughout 8 years, they were methodically shelled, maimed, and killed with impunity. It would take a long time to list all the inhuman crimes of the Ukrainian punitive battalions against innocent people. I will only recall the tragedy in the Odessa Trade Union House when 48 people were killed rather, 42 were burned alive, and those who managed to jump out the windows of the burning building were shot to death. I will also recall the death of the Gorlovka Madonna during shelling in 2014. Images of a mutilated body of a young woman clutching her 10-month-old daughter to her chest flew around the world and became a symbol of Kiev's inhuman policies. However, they went unnoticed by Western patrons of the Banderite neo-Nazis, and there are hundreds of such examples. Crimea was luckier. Almost immediately after the coup, having rightly assessed the true nature and the true face of the new authorities, Crimeans made a choice in favor of returning to their historical homelands in accordance with the right to self-determination as enshrined in the UN Charter. Further events confirmed that this was the right choice. After the special military operation began in order to stop the 8-year war of the Kiev regime against the civilians of Donbass, 4 other former Ukrainian regions made the same decision as Crimea. This turn of events is extremely inconvenient for Ukraine. After all, the stories about Ukrainian citizens being afraid of Russian armed forces, stories that they will face a true guerrilla war, are completely destroyed by irrefutable facts testifying to the contrary. The people of the liberated towns are greeting Russian soldiers as liberators. They were thankful that Russia has not abandoned them. We have just seen this in Kiev, where civilians rejoiced at the arrival of our soldiers, because in Avdiivka, over 9 years, Ukrainian Nazis created a super fortified frontier from which they methodically shelled Donetsk a few kilometers away. And before the start of the military operation, the real thorn in the side of the Kiev regime was the publications of its own citizens, a million of whom annually vacationed in the Russian Crimea and published glowing reviews online. The representative of Kiev naturally failed to say in a statement that the Crimean Peninsula was a completely abandoned region when it was part of Ukraine. Its infrastructure was neglected, its socioeconomic problems were addressed as an afterthought and in a piecemeal fashion. Over the past 10 years, however, Crimea has been transformed. Socioeconomic projects are being implemented in the areas of healthcare, culture, and education. Real salaries in the public sector are growing, along with pensions and benefits. Thermal power plants have been put into operation. Gas pipelines, transportation infrastructure is being constructed. The acute issue of water supply, which was created by the neo-Nazis who organized the water blockade of Ukraine, has also been resolved. 2 years ago, the dam put up by Ukraine to block the water was finally removed. Vast amounts of work have been done to increase the investment and tourism attractiveness of the region. I would like to particularly address the issue of the rights and freedoms of national minorities living in Crimea. In recent years, Kiev has been telling horror stories about Russia's alleged infringement on the rights of Crimean Tatars and the erasure of their identity. However, the recent decision of the International Court of Justice on Ukraine's claim under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination has fully demonstrated the invalidity of these claims. What's more, the court found no signs of racial discrimination in Russian legislation and its application in practice. It also rejected the false accusations of discrimination against Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians with regard to their access to media, education, and cultural opportunities in their own languages. The following fact, which came to light during the trial, is very telling. Kiev tried to accuse Russia of destroying Crimea's cultural heritage. However, it was established that our state was actually engaged in a large-scale and expensive restoration project meant to rebuild historical monuments that had fallen into disrepair and begun to deteriorate while Crimea was part of Ukraine. Projects are also being implemented in Novorossiya and Donbass to revitalize those regions and incorporate them into the unified legal and socioeconomic framework of the country. Industry, agriculture, infrastructure are being restored. The goal is to make sure these regions catch up to the national average in key areas that determine the quality of life by 2030. Most importantly, our new citizens are themselves enthusiastically participating in these processes, and they see their future as part of Russia. Mr. President, if we look at everything that took place over the past 10 years, the question that arises is, could this have all been avoided? Russia did not start this war. It came to put an end to it. All the Kiev authorities had to do was respect people's rights, let them live in peace on their own territory, study in their own language, enjoy freedom of religion and freedom of thought. to not shy away from direct dialogue with dissenters, but rather to make the necessary efforts to ensure a decent future for them as part of Ukraine. And by the way, this is exactly what was promised before the presidential elections in 2019 by the candidate Zelensky. 2/3 of voters eventually ended up voting for him. However, once in power, he forgot about all his promises and let himself be drawn into the Western geopolitical game against Russia. And the chance for peace was lost. Many people ask us, what can we do now? What can bring peace back to Ukraine? We have said many times that to do this, the goals of our special military operations formulated following 8 years of Ukraine's post-Maidan development must be met. We are ready to do this through negotiations and have never abandoned them, unlike the Kiev regime, which, at the instigation of its Western puppet masters helmed by Boris Johnson, refused to engage in dialogue with us and to sign the agreement already initialed in Istanbul in April 2022, instead passing a law prohibiting negotiations with Russia, and condemned tens of thousands of young and not so young Ukrainians to die in the fire of this war. One should not waste time on Kiev's futile plans to negotiate on the basis of Zelensky's so-called peace formula. It is nothing other than an ultimatum to Russia and an attempt to lure as many countries as possible into endless meetings on this utopian project at any price possible. This fabrication is already clear to many of those who at first unwittingly found themselves drawn into Kiev's deceitful scheme. If there are no real negotiations based on a genuine assessment of the situation on the ground, the goals of the special military operation will Ward, Mortar Platoon Commander, Junior Lieutenant Semyon Ivanovich Zelensky, the Order of the Red Star, for the valor and courage he displayed during the liberation of Ukraine from the German Nazis. He had yet to turn 20 years old. If he were alive today and wanted to honor the memory of his fellow soldiers, he would be arrested, possibly beaten, and thrown into the prisons of the Ukrainian Security Service, where he would be tortured to death, as happened to the American journalist Gonzalo Lira. This is the regime that was established in Ukraine by his grandson Vladimir, who today honors the Nazi criminals and collaborators who killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians during the war, to honor them as heroes. And today, those who fought alongside us against the Nazis 80 years ago are trying to save this regime. It is no coincidence that the entire Western camp, and not only Germany, Italy, and Japan, who lost in the Second World War, are opposing the condemnation of Nazis in the General Assembly, while those who fought with the Nazis are being extolled. By the way, today is a holiday in Russia where we honor the defenders of our fatherland, the veterans, fathers, and grandfathers who sacrificed their lives defending their homeland. Thanks to their heroic feats and bravery, our nation defeated Nazism 80 years ago and is defeating it today. Happy holiday, dear defenders. Our cause is just and we will prevail. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and I now invite His Excellency Xavier Bettel, the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg, to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must tell you that to speak after the representative of the Russian Federation is not an easy task. I've come here, as I always do. When I speak, they leave. They take the floor, but then there's an empty chair, and so it's difficult, Ambassador, to have a dialogue. Well, I'm one of the rare heads of state and government that had contact with both the presidents of Russia and Ukraine at the beginning of the conflict. I did that because in order to have a dialogue, you need to listen to people. And even though it might surprise some people that I had President Putin's ear, I also had President Zelensky's ear, of course. But after listening, one needs results. And I saw on the Russian side that the willingness to cease the war was the last concern on their mind. And Bucha, Irpin, and just after discussions, I was told that they wanted peace, but what we saw showed that that's not what they had in mind. So today, we are here not to commemorate something happy. We are here to show that we are on the side of Ukraine. And I have a Russian grandmother, and when you say that there are Nazis in Kiev here, believe me, there are no more in Kiev than there are in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It is shameful to make people believe that the Ukraine and Kiev regime is supporting Nazis and that Ukraine is full of Nazis. And then today to try to rewrite history by saying that you are protecting Russians against Nazis, given what you did during the Second World War. That is not good for the memory of the Russian fighters in the Second World War. This is not a unilateral attack. You're a great country. And I say that this is a very sensitive issue for me that's close to my heart. People are trying to divide us in Europe and worldwide. There are pro-Russians, and I said this as well to President Putin when I spoke to him, that his best friends are in Pyongyang or in Syria or in Iran. And that shows how Russia is isolated compared to the Russia that we knew before. Russia, which after a period of communism, tried to look for partners, had cultural and political and economic relations, friendly relations with other countries. Today, it finds itself isolated. And I said this at the last meeting that we had in Skopje, and I welcome our colleague here. I said this to the Russian representative there as well. Starting a war is not great. Putting an end to a war is greatness. And it's time to show to recognize error. And today, we see the very foundations of this assembly. I mean, we've just listened to a speech that shows that anything that we might say is really out of line with what Russia has said, which is not reality. You can't rewrite history. You simply need to recognize an error. To say that you are defending the Russian population, that you want to defend today, well, Europe against Nazis in Ukraine, when the result today is that the neighbors of Ukraine are trembling. The Baltic countries, or Poland, or Romania, or Moldavia, Georgia, these are countries that are afraid of Russia and that can't sleep at night now because Russia has become an unpredictable, dangerous country, a country which does not respect any law that we would like to see respected. That's the most important thing. And you said this, Russian ambassador, as well, that it's important to recover these Russian territories, but you don't make borders overnight and try to redesign things. International law means that borders are pre-established. It's not because you're bigger and stronger that you can redefine the size of your country and take something from someone else. I mean, I had that experience in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. We had a bigger neighbor, Germany, and now we are partners with Germany, we're friends with Germany, we're neighbors. We want to build something together with them. Just realize what you are doing. Now, I've spoken to Putin several times, and I said, when you're prepared to come to the negotiating table, we are prepared to talk to you. But you need to recognize the mistakes that you have made. You need to stop killing generations, depriving children of education. I mean, children today can't have a normal education. And how will you explain to those women and those children, those Russian mothers, that you have sent their children to the abattoir to be slaughtered just because of a mistake that you have made? How will you explain that in the history books? Will it once again be something that is going to be deleted from the news in Russia because it bothers certain people? Impunity is also something that we always have to be aware of. You can't attack someone and say, assume that nothing will happen afterwards. We know that your supporters are ever more reduced in number today. Ukraine is a country that's been attacked, and the attacker is Russia. And we will continue to support Ukraine. We will continue to support the colleagues today that are being subject to this aggression, but realize one day, I mean, when I was there, when you go to Ukraine, you see the strength of Ukrainians. A lot of us thought that Ukraine would fold and that Russia was going to just steamroller them. But no, they're fighting, and they're not just fighting for themselves, they're also fighting for us. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Luxembourg, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Slovenia, Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. These days we are marking the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and almost 10 years since the destabilization of the region has begun with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The second and 10th anniversary are an opportunity to recap what the UN and its member states can do in order to stabilize the region and bring just and lasting peace to Ukraine. There have been many discussions about what can be done and what should be done in this respect. Allow me to present Slovenia's take in few points. 1, peace. Peace should come to Ukraine. It may seem impossible at times, but it will happen. What we can do to expedite it is to support the peace process that is taking shape within Ukraine's peace formula. Russia needs to do its part. Russia must stop the aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Its war rhetoric and threats need to cease. Another important step towards peace where we can aid Ukraine is to support global and regional initiatives aimed at providing a stable foothold for its reconstruction and environmental recovery. Slovenia is gravely concerned with existing environmental impacts of the war and is dreading potential ones. All of us can continue to support the EIEA and its efforts to prevent a nuclear accident in Ukraine. 2, international humanitarian law should and must be respected. With all the ruined homes, hospitals, and schools, and with civilian casualties on the rise for the consecutive months, this is obviously not the case. If lasting peace is to come to Ukraine, accountability needs to be assured. What we can do in this respect is to lay the groundwork for justice to be served in the future. We can support the strengthening of the international legal framework and assist in the establishment of the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The recently signed Ljubljana, the Hague Convention, is an important complementary mechanism responding to violations by fighting impunity and promoting accountability for the most serious international crimes. And 3, the humanitarian situation should be addressed. We are witnessing the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. An estimated 14.6 million Ukrainians will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. And we should take care that it reaches as many as possible, especially in light of increasing needs in other crisis areas around the world, such as Gaza. Slovenia will do its part. At the same time, 30% of Ukraine is contaminated with landmines, the highest percentage of any country in the world. We see humanitarian demining as a vital step towards normalization and economic recovery of the country. Mr. President, let me conclude with the following. There is no room for double standards. No one should ignore violations of international law, neither in Ukraine nor in Gaza. We will not allow undermining of international organizations. We will not allow undermining of our institutions. We demand respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law across the board by everyone, everywhere, and at all the time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia, and I now invite Her Excellency Helena Carreras, the Minister of National Defense of Poland, no? Portugal, to take the floor.
President, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on the situation of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It has now been 10 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. More than 700 days of death and destruction have passed. More than 700 days of a war that has taken its toll on innocent civilians, with a disproportionate burden inflicted on women, children, and the elderly. More than 700 days of human suffering, death, injury, displacement, loss of critical infrastructure, reduced access to healthcare and education, and curtailment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. On this somber date, we cannot and will not fail to reiterate our resolute and unwavering condemnation of Russia's unprovoked, illegal, and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a blatant violation of international law for which it must be held fully accountable. From the outset, Portugal has been unequivocal about where we stand, side by side with Ukraine in the defense of rules, principles, and values that should guide us all. Rules, principles, and values that are enshrined in the UN Charter. We are part of the overwhelming majority of this General Assembly, which has voted in favor of 6 resolutions condemning the invasion and calling for the end of Russia's war of aggression. Our support is comprehensive, be it on the political, financial, humanitarian, and also at the military level. We will continue to assist the brave Ukrainian armed forces in exercising its legitimate right to self-defense against an illegal aggression. We have welcomed nearly 6,000 refugees in Portugal while focusing on reconstruction efforts, such as in the case of the public school system of the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr. But this discussion is not just about Ukraine. It is about upholding the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We cannot remain on the sidelines while the most fundamental principles of the international legal and security order are blatantly disregarded. None of us can feel safe until this war ends. This can only happen with a comprehensive and just solution that is in accordance with the UN Charter and in line with Ukraine's peace formula. But let us recall that any such solution cannot fail to consider the occupied territories of Crimea and Donbas since 2014. Allow me to be very clear. We do not recognize these illegal annexation attempts. Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson are part of Ukraine. The report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, dated last October, gives us an appalling picture of the situation in terms of human rights and highlights the many cases of torture and violence, including sexual violence, perpetrated against civilians with a disproportionate impact on women, children, and older persons. That is why we support every action being taken by the International Criminal Court to hold accountable those responsible for these atrocities and to ensure justice for all the victims. Portugal also participates in the core group for accountability of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and support the Council of Europe's Register of Damage. The humanitarian crisis caused by this war has to end. President, when I visited Kyiv on February 2023, on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion, it was impossible to remain indifferent to the bravery of a people besieged by an unscrupulous aggressor. This bravery only found correspondence in the unshakable confidence of a nation determined to defeat a brutal and unjustified invasion. The remarkable resilience of Ukrainian men and women and their will to prevail are an inspiration to the world and a lesson to the aggressor. Yet, the impacts of this war are not confined to Europe. Russia's aggression has a direct effect on the global food, energy, and financial crisis, with severe impacts on the most vulnerable countries. The role of the UN Secretary General in mitigating these effects has proven invaluable. But this situation cannot be tolerated, and we will continue to support all collective efforts in this regard. We know that other pressing crises around the world require our attention and our action, but we need to be coherent, and therefore we cannot fail the people of Ukraine. So, together, united, we must remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of National Defense of Portugal. And I now invite His Excellency Buhar Usmani, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, to take the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on this important occasion as we mark 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor. 2 years, a war of aggression in Europe in the 21st century. 2 years of Russia's continued attempt to influence, interfere, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe, and 2 full years of death, destruction, and human suffering. Excellencies, I urge Russia once again to end this senseless war and withdraw its troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia violated the basic principles of international law and UN Charter and launched a fully fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, a UN member state, and a peaceful neighbor. We condemn and reject the attempted illegal annexation by Russia of Ukraine's territories, as we have witnessed since 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and Sevastopol. Furthermore, Russia has committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which have been documented by international monitoring mechanisms alleging war crimes. North Macedonia is also strongly concerned and condemns Russia's unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus, and calls upon them to ensure their safe return. Mr. President, the war of aggression against Ukraine stands in stark contrast to our shared commitment to peace, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, shaking security fundaments of Europe. This war has changed our way of life and challenged the very essence of the word freedom. Along with our strong condemnations of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we concurrently condemn Russia's continuous attempts to interfere, influence, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe. While we are witnessing a full-scale war against Ukraine, in parallel, we are observing ongoing hybrid threats across Europe's regions and in Balkans also. The hybridity of Russia's hostile campaigns beyond Ukraine diverge from region to region, but the pattern and the anticipated end results are identical, generating instability and chaos. Russia, through its known hybrid means, is present in every societal pore. In North Macedonia and across our region, in the heart of Europe, we feel the adversity and the negative effects of this strategic influence. The security risks for Europe are imminent. It's clear, lingering threat to the whole of Europe, and we must say no to Russia's hostile campaign. Our response to this is defining our own future trajectory. Our response is clear: no to Russia, yes to Europe, strong, united, and integrated. Our shared no to Russia has to be loud, resolute, and consistent. It is our duty to expose Russia across the multilateral space and to keep insisting on moral, legal, and political accountability, to disarm and dismantle the system of disinformation and false narratives, to separate good from bad, truth from lies, right from wrong. Our country belongs and stands aside with the rest of the free world that believes in the ideals of peace, liberty, and democracy, fully aware and cognizant of the ultimate value and importance of these differences. North Macedonia is a functional multi-ethnic democracy resting on solid foundations. Our past and present speaks of a resilient society capable to withstand different trials and challenges. Mr. President, we must say no to Russia for the sake of the new generations, so they can live in peace, freed from fear of war and distrustful sense of insecurity, that the destiny of the Ukrainians could one day be their own. We reiterate the importance of investigating the war crimes on the territory of Ukraine, and North Macedonia will continue to engage in the work of the core group on options for the establishment of a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Excellencies, the discussion in this plenary is not only about Ukraine, but about each and every country present in the General Assembly. It is about respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states who rely on the norms and principles of international law and observe the Charter of the United Nations. It is about our shared democratic values and interests. It is about the sovereign rights of each state to choose its future. It is about the sovereign right of each state to defend itself against aggression. And the Russian Federation, a P5 member, violated these fundamental principles cherished by all and agreed upon by all. I call you to stand united and support Ukraine. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, and I now invite His Excellency Gordan Grilic Radman, the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, to take the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. After 2 long and painful years, Russia is still conducting its brutal military aggression against Ukraine. Such flagrant breach of international law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter is an affront to the fundamental values of peace, security, and respect for the sovereignty of all nations. This aggression brings us to the brink of breaking the global system as a whole, endangering the ideas of freedom, sovereignty, and independence. We call on Russia to cease all combat operations and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. We regret the tremendous loss of all life resulting from Russia's senseless war and reaffirm our steadfast support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the much desired peace can only be lasting if it is just. For peace to be just, it has to be anchored in accountability. For this reason, accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine must be upheld, not only because it provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. With this in mind, Croatia supports efforts to promote accountability for international crimes committed in and against Ukraine in all relevant multilateral fora, including the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. We have stood by Ukraine and its people from day one. We have provided aid, and over 25,000 Ukrainians have found temporary protection in Croatia. Croatia herself was a victim of aggression and has had war on her soil. Following our own painful experience, today we not only understand but strongly support and participate in all initiatives aimed at relieving the suffering of the Ukrainian population, especially the weakest and the most vulnerable ones. Besides the energy crisis, one of the most dramatic effects of the Russian aggression in the threat of food shortage looming over large parts of the world. Ukraine needs our collective support in its demining efforts. Croatia herself, with vast experience in demining her own territory, will remain committed to national and international actions in addressing